Hey guys, Political Junkie 2414 here, and welcome back to my next election prediction video. So, in today's video, we're going to be doing, an updated look at the 2022 U.S. Senate elections, the midterm Senate elections this year. It's time for my bi-weekly update. I am back from vacation. Sorry I did not make, the prediction yesterday. I was hoping to, but, I had a lot going on, and so I just was not able to squeeze it in yesterday. It's August 14th, 2022 right now. So we're going to do a mid-August update. And so, yeah, let's get right into it. The midterms, have been changing a lot over these last couple of months. Roe v. Wade was overturned, and Republicans' lead in the generic ballot it's non-existent now. Democrats, let me pull it up actually. Democrats have now officially taken the lead in the generic ballot. Very narrowly, yes, but it is still a lead. The first time since November of 2021. I believe it was, what day was it? August 4th was the day that the Democrats took the lead, or, got slightly above it. And so, yeah, and now Democrats are nearly leading in the generic ballot. Of course, that doesn't mean they're going to be leading in it for the rest of the midterm election cycle. It'll probably go back and forth between the GOP and the Democratic Party. The GOP is not in a good spot right now, and a lot of that has to do with the way that they have, especially in the Senate elections, and a lot of that has to do with the candidates that they have, nominated in some of these more competitive races. Take Blake Masters in Arizona, Herschel Walker in Georgia, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. Who else? The J.D. Vance, I guess you could argue, in Ohio. Don Bolduc, in New Hampshire. That primary hasn't occurred yet, but I'm assuming he will be the nominee. We'll talk about that in a minute. And but Republicans have, well, first of all, Democrats have put up some pretty stellar candidates in the Senate elections. They only had one retiring incumbent that was in Vermont, which we will talk about in a minute. But Republicans have fielded some better candidates in states like Nevada with Adam Laxalt, Colorado with Joe O'Dea, Ted Budd in North Carolina. What are some other ones? Eric Schmidt in Missouri, yeah, which we'll talk about in a minute. They did not nominate Eric Greitens, which pretty much saved them. Yeah, so that is, really my introduction. Let's get into filling in the safe Democratic and Republican states. These are states that are going to go to whichever party by, by 15% or higher, for 15 percentage points or higher. These states are, pretty much, guaranteed to go to the party that I am characterizing them for. Um, the only real reason why you would question these states is because either mainly playing this game that I've kind of dubbed the what if game. And what I mean by that is really you just kind of ask yourself, what if this race is competitive, or what if that race is competitive? And that's not a very good way to predict Senate elections, because, in elections in general, because, anything's possible in American politics. We saw that with Trump in 2016. But we have to go off of, probability with a lot of these Senate elections, and look at the data, and also look at candidate quality. For example, in Colorado, the incumbent there, Alex Padilla, the Democratic incumbent, is projected to win his reelection in a landslide. California usually gives Democrats 20 to 30 percentage point margins in statewide elections. Biden won the state in 2020 by almost 30 points. The only thing that will make you question this race is, what if he loses? Of course, Padilla, you might recognize his name, you might not. This was Kamala Harris's seat, and Padilla was appointed to it after she became vice president. For a Republican example, you could pick the state of Idaho, which is rapidly growing in population, so Idaho might be a competitive state in the future, but right now it isn't. The incumbent Republican senator there, Mike Crapo, and by incumbent, the current office holder. That's what incumbent means. But the incumbent Republican Senator Mike Crapo is very popular in the state. Won by almost 40 points beforehand in his last election. Has been serving in the Senate for a little over almost 24 years now. He is running for re-election. He is pretty much guaranteed to win his re-election. You wouldn't expect to see Idaho go blue, or California go red. Look at that. That looks really silly. But yeah, either way, that is just basically explaining and making it easier to understand why some races are not as competitive as others. We are going to talk about some of these safe states though, because some of them might be competitive. In the state of Washington, we've had some primaries recently too. Patty Murray in Washington, she's the incumbent Democratic senator. She has been serving in the Senate since 1993, so since Bill Clinton's time. She did have a surprisingly close race here in 2010, which was a Republican wave year. Dina Rossi was a good candidate for the GOP to run. This race was pretty much a dead heat going into election day. Murray won by 5 points, which isn't a good margin for a Democrat, but it was a lot, especially in Washington. Um, statewide for Washington's standards, but it was still a lot better than the victory that was expected for Murray or, potential Republican flip. There was some talk about this race being potentially competitive because of that. Murray is not the most popular senator, but you have to remember Washington's a blue state that voted for Biden by 20 points in 2020, almost 20 points, I believe. It was like 19.2 or something, but rounding up. Tiffany Smiley is the Republican candidate, and of course, Washington's primary system is kind of weird. It's kind of similar to California, where they have an all like an open primary or an open blanket primary, and so whoever the top two vote getters usually advance to the general election. And typically, these primary election results are about 5 or 6 points more Republican, or the Democrat gets 5 or 6 points, percentage points less than what they get in the general election. Um, in 2016, Murray won re-election by 18% with 18% of the vote. So if we go off of that, trend, we would say that Murray wins by with about 58% of the vote, and I think that's pretty reasonable. I think Murray's going to win by 15 or the 16 percentage points. It'll be it'll be barely safe in my opinion. I think the margin's going to go down, but this state is still going to go overwhelmingly for Patty Murray. There's really no shot at it being competitive. The idea for it being competitive was to, for the GOP was, to get Democrats to worry about that state, which would distract them from more competitive races the GOP could pick up, like Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania. Um, Pennsylvania was Republican held, though, or is Republican held. Republican held, New Hampshire, Colorado. Colorado, we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, so that's it for Washington and Illinois. There has been some interesting numbers that do make me question whether or not Tammy Duckworth is going to win by a safe margin. She won by 15 points in in her first election. This seat, as you can see, has been very, very unfavorable to incumbents. In 1992, was the last time that the incumbent party held the seat. This class-free seat that is up in 2022, not, Illinois, both of its Senate seats, but this one in particular. Carrie Mosley Braun defeated Alan Dixon in the Democratic primary. She held on to it in 1992. She lost in 1998 to Peter Fitzgerald, who later retired in 2004. He was replaced by a little known candidate, Barack Obama. Sure, you've never heard of him. After he got elected to President of the United States, he was after Obama got elected to President of the as President of the United States. He was replaced by a Democrat who decided not to, or a Democrat was appointed to replace him. I think his name was Roland Burris, who didn't run in 2010. Republican Mark Kirk then won the seat, and in 2010, massive red wave year, he lost it in 2016. And it was very close to being a likely state for Tammy Duckworth, and it is a redder national environment, I would argue, than in 2016 still. Although I guess that's kind of debatable. I think it's, they're both, 2016 was expected to be a pretty decent, it was pretty neutral year, and 2022 looks like it's going to be a pretty neutral year as well. It does still have the Republican lean, but, there's a lot that is not, suggesting that anymore. Or a lot of things, like Democrats taking the lead in the generic ballot. Um, so Tammy Duckworth, I think, wins by a safe margin. This is a Republican-sponsored poll that shows her down, or shows her up by only 9 points to the Republican Kathy Salvi, or Salvi. I think it's Salvi, but it has a large undecided number, and it is, a Republican-sponsored poll. Illinois polls do sometimes underestimate Democrats, so that, or it is a state that Democrats are underestimated occasionally. in. So there could be something there, too. I think that if it was a single digit race, I'd be pretty shocked. That would be a very good showing for the Republican Party in Illinois, but it's still a blue state. Voted for Biden by 16 points, I think 17 points, yeah. And it's going, Tammy Duckworth is going to win re-election and be the first senator to, the first incumbent senator to win this seat or win re-election to the seat in almost in over 36 years, or in 36 years. Vermont was another state that held its primaries recently. It was this week. Patrick Leahy, the incumbent Democratic senator who has been there for nearly 50 years, I know, it's crazy. He is finally, or he is, decided to retire now. And the incumbent Democratic congressman for Vermont at large congressional district, it only has one congressional district. That congressman is Peter Welch. He won the Democratic primary decisively this Tuesday, and there was some talk about this race being potentially competitive. Vermont used to be a pretty red state, up until around Bill Clinton's time. But, since it's become a safe blue state, and, Democrats are at a bit of a disadvantage with Leahy not running, but still, Vermont's a safe blue state. He was going to elect Peter Welch. He is very, very well known in the state. The state's population is so small that he is its only congressman. Vermont, open elections are rare, which, meant this race could have been more competitive in a Republican leaning year, but I don't, that was a bit of a stretch anyways. The only candidate I could see against Welch making this race potentially competitive was Christina Nolan, who was a pretty moderate Republican who was pretty liberal on social issues, pro-abortion, I believe, pro-gay rights, is gay herself, supported Ketanji Brown Jackson, pretty much a Jim Jeffords type of Republican. So she could have made the race interesting, but she lost the Democrat or the Republican primary to Gerald Malloy, who I think is a businessman. Um, and he is, probably more conservative than she is. I don't think Christina Nolan really had that much of a shot at this race. She could have, but she lost the primary, and yeah, there's really no chance at Democrats losing this seat now. It was a very small chance that that this race would end up being competitive, but now it's pretty much out of the question that Peter Welch is going to have a very easy time winning the seat and succeeding Leahy. And the final safe blue state I want to talk about, I want to make this quick because I'm going to talk about a couple of Republican seats too. Before we get on to the likely states. So in Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal is running for his third term. He's the incumbent Democratic senator. He his primary, or well, technically Blumenthal didn't have a primary on Tuesday because he had already been nominated as the Democratic nominee, ran unopposed. The Republican nominee is Leora Levy, who got Trump's endorsement at the last minute. I did previously have this race as likely blue when I thought Themis Chlorides was going to be the nominee. But Blumenthal has been underestimated before in polling. Connecticut's a very blue state, and there was really no chance of this race being competitive. And it's a very blue state, and Blumenthal won by almost 30 points in his last election. I have a hard time seeing that narrow up below 15%. It could happen, but I think it's still a safe blue state. For some of the safe Republican seats that are going to be, or that could possibly or potentially be competitive or slightly, we have Utah. Mike Lee is the incumbent Republican there, running against Evan McMullin, a former. He's a conservative independent. He ran for president in 2016. Got a decent amount of the vote in Utah. He held Donald Trump under a majority in Utah. He split. He split. He had he got like a quarter of the vote. He got behind Hillary Clinton, but he still did very well in the state. And Utah is very traditional, Republican kind of state. It has a large Mormon population. Mitt Romney is very popular in the state. The other senator there, Mike Lee, is very unpopular. And Evan McMullin was endorsed by the Democratic Party of Utah, and they decided not to put up their own candidate because they hate Mike Lee and they really want him out. So they thought, if we get Democrats behind him, while McMullin also appeals to some more traditional conservatives in Utah, Maybe we could have a shot at making this race competitive. And I think that this race will be slightly competitive. McMullen has said that, he won't caucus with either party. If he is elected to the Senate as an independent, he is, pretty moderate on some issues, but he does lean, he is more conservative than he is liberal. Um, uh, and he is Mormon, just like Mike Lee. I think that he will do fairly well, but politicians don't always keep their promises with, him doing well doesn't have anything to do with promises, but in terms of the caucusing with the GOP or with the Democratic Party, I think if McMullen was to win this race, he would, if he had to caucus, or if he was going to caucus with either party, would be the GOP, and I think he probably would. And also, Lee is still, is still holding his own. There are a lot of undecideds in these polls. The race is going to be closer than it was in 2016. But I still think Lee is clearly favored to win this Senate election. If McMullen does win, though, I do think he would probably caucus with the GOP. But if he didn't, he'd be an independent. And if this race gets closer, and the poll quality starts to improve because the last poll had McMullen down by 5, but there's a lot of other undecided voters. So, yeah, we're just gonna have to see what happens here. And then the final safe state I want to talk about before we go on to the actually competitive states. I don't like talking about these states too much because they extend the video. I'll talk about Kentucky very briefly. With incumbent Republican Rand Paul. Before I go to the Missouri, Rand Paul did finish with, last time he was on the ballot, he only won by about 15%. This was a likely state when Trump won Kentucky by 30 points in 2016. So Paul does have, is a bit of a, he is a controversial incumbent, and, he could be. This could be potentially competitive, but the Democrat here, Charles Booker, is very progressive, not as conservative as some other Democrats, and the nation's becoming very polarized. And Kentucky is still a safe red state. Paul almost won by a safe margin last time. I think he can absolutely do it. I think this race will be around 20 points for Rand Paul. And then in Missouri, I'm keeping this a safe Republican because Eric Schmidt, as predicted, did win the Republican primary. If you guys saw my video, making fun of Trump, Trump did decide to endorse kind of troll in this race. He what's the word? He endorsed Eric in the state, even though there are two Erics running, Eric Schmidt and Eric Greitens. There's actually another Eric, but he's a very moderate candidate. I think was like Eric McElroy. Yeah, here he is, but he barely got any of the votes. So it was either between Schmidt or Greitens. Vicky Hartzler had Trump had made it clear he wasn't going to endorse her, and Schmidt ended up winning the primary pretty decisively. So yeah, and so Republicans have pretty much averted disaster, and yeah. Missouri is going to be a safe red state. So I'm sorry that I spent so much time on those safe states. I just wanted to give a couple of thoughts on them. We're going to go into the likely states now. We have one likely state for Democrats. That's the state of Colorado. I did make a video talking about some races, the Senate races that the GOP is overestimating their chances of flipping. Colorado was one of those states. It voted for Biden by about 14 points in 2020. Michael Bennet is a very strong incumbent as well. He won by 6 points in 2016, defied all odds in 2010, winning by about 2 points. He was expected to lose this race. Ken Buck was a controversial Republican nominee, but this was a very good year, for the GOP. And, Bennett was able to hold on, and that really showed his strength. Joe O'Dea is the Republican nominee. Democrats are trying to lift up his primary opponent, Ron Hanks, who's like a super far right Trump supporter, because they feared that Joe O'Dea would be harder to beat in the general election. Oh, and look at this. They finally put out a new poll that was Republican sponsored. I didn't see this. I guess this came out today. So Bennett is leading over O'Dea by 8 points in this most recent poll. I think that's pretty accurate. Some people are saying he's going to win by 9, 10 points. I think he'll win about the same margin he won by last time. I think, O'Dea, he is a moderate Republican, pro-choice. He kind of gives you these Westerner cowboy vibes, which might, make people think it's kind of a weirdo. But I think, he will do fairly well for a Republican in Colorado. But, the governor's race that's taking place at the same time as this Senate race is going to help Michael Bennet. I think he's going to win this race pretty much no matter what, unless things get terrible for the Democratic Party come November, which they very well could be. Colorado could flip, but I just don't really see it. It's not really one of the GOP's top targets. It's one of their reach states, and the states move farther and farther away from the Republican Party in recent years. So, yeah, that's it for the likely Democratic state. We have two likely Republican states. We have the states of Iowa and Florida. We're going to go over Florida first. There has been some concern about Marco Rubio on the Republican side. The Democratic nominee is assumed to be Val Demings. The primary in Florida still hasn't occurred. It's going to happen, I think, next week, not this week, not the upcoming week, the week after that. Val Demings, is a pretty good candidate for Democrats to run. She would get a lot of the young vote and, a lot of the minority vote out in Florida. And Florida is not necessarily a safe Republican state yet, but it certainly has shifted heavy to the right or heavily to the right. But Marco Rubio is a pretty strong incumbent. He outpaced Trump by almost 7 points in 2016. While Trump won the state by just 1 point over Hillary Clinton, Rubio won re-election by 8 points. And, that has to do a lot with Hispanic voters, with him being very popular with Hispanic voters. And even in, this is kind of a similar story to Herschel Walker in Georgia. We'll get to that in a minute. But, with Val Demings, with some Democratic sponsored polls, the best that she could do is tie with Rubio. I think Rubio is going to win by around 9, 10 points. This race could end up being more competitive, but still, it is a competitive state, but it's not going to be all that competitive this time around. Ron DeSantis is going to help Rubio. Rubio is going to help DeSantis. And yeah, Florida is kind of, I would say, it's gonna be very hard for Democrats to flip it. I think if Charlie Crist gets the gubernatorial nomination, that could help Val Demings. I do expect him to be the Democratic nominee for governor. But I think that in that case, it would really only affect the governor election with DeSantis. Yeah, but because Rubio is so popular and Florida's already moving to the right, Cuban vote's going to break heavily for Marco Rubio. I think he may even win Miami-Dade County. That's a bit of a stretch, though. But, Hispanic voters are going to, probably turn out mostly for Rubio. In the state of Iowa, this might surprise you. I will admit that I was kind of a little too early to call this race competitive. So Chuck Grassley is the incumbent Republican senator here. He is very old in terms of age and in the Senate, he's one of the oldest members of the Senate by age and also by seniority. In terms of how long he's been serving is what I mean by seniority as well. He is almost 89 years old. He's been serving in the Senate since 1981. He was first elected in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was first elected president. And he is a very popular incumbent. He's won by very strong margins in the past. Recently his margins have been getting a little bit smaller. And, he is running for his 8th term in the U.S. Senate. With Patrick Leahy retiring in Vermont, if Grassley was to win re-election, he'd become the most senior member of the U.S. Senate. He would become the president pro tempore of the Senate again if Republicans took back the Senate. And yeah, he is very old. He's going to be 89 in about a month from now. But despite his large amount of appeal in the state of Iowa, a state that has been pretty competitive in recent years, or in the last 20 years. And yes, Iowa has shifted to the right, but Chuck Grassley has always been very strong in the state, even when Democrats have been able to do very well there in presidential elections. John Kerry almost won the state in 2004. Grassley in the concurrent Senate election won 70% of the vote. He won by over 40 points. And so, even though Iowa is getting redder generally, it does look like Grassley's grip on the state is starting to withhold or, starting to loosen. And the Democratic nominee, Michael Franken, is doing pretty well in polling. I don't really think that this is a winnable race for Michael Franken. Beating Chuck Grassley is going to take a lot, but I think that, this will give Republicans a scare. And I think that this is a sign to Chuck Grassley. I personally don't think he should have run for another term because he's going to be 95 by the time, if he finishes his term, by the time it ends in 2029. The term that if he is re-elected, which I expect him to be this year, then he will be 95 by the time he finishes this Senate term he's about to be elected to. If he finishes it, I I could very well see, I don't mean this, in a violent way or anything, not trying to suggest any violence. So don't say that. But I wouldn't be surprised necessarily if Grassley was had to resign because of age and or possibly sadly passed away. During this final Senate term of his. He could run again in 2028, but he would be even older then. And I honestly. I don't say this out of anger towards Chuck Grassley, but I say it more out of a sign that he's getting really old, and there's a lot of talk about Dianne Feinstein, being too old to serve in California, the Democratic senator, who's the only senator who is older than Grassley only by a couple months. I could very well see Grassley going down a similar path of dementia as Feinstein has. We don't know if it's dementia that's going on with Feinstein. Excuse me, I didn't mean to, offend her. But it does seem like there's some cognitive issues happening with her. She is very old as well, and I think it's a sign that these folks, these older folks in Congress that have been in there for so long, they really need to retire for their own good, or they're going to end up dying in here. And I say that I say that out of sadness. But that being said, I don't think Chuck Grassley is going to lose his reelection. He's still too popular in the state. Iowa did not want him to run for another term. I expected him to retire. Um, but about a year ago, he did say that he was going to run again, and Michael Franco was the right choice for Democrats to uh, pick. And the polls, one of the polls in the state, the Sulzer and Co. Poll released here only has Grassley winning by about 8 points against Franken. I don't know if I buy it being that close. I think this will be double digits for Grassley, probably a 13 or 14 point margin. This race could be safe. Grassley, there were some polls in 2016, and there was some expectation that he would face a competitive race from Patty Judge that didn't end up happening. And I don't know if I would call this race super competitive, but I would call it, Grassley's most competitive Senate election since, his initial election in 1980. So, gonna have to see what's going on here in the state of Iowa. Could be wrong. This could be still a safe Republican state, but it is going to be probably going to be Grassley's closest election in quite some time in since the beginning of his tenure really in the state of Iowa. So sorry that this video is going on for so long. We're going to get into the lean states. So in the likely states, so that I point out, these are states that Colorado, Iowa, and Florida, they voted for, they will vote for from my projections, what likely states in my opinion, or with me, likely states are states that are decided by 5 to 15 point margins. For the for the parties that I'm characterizing them for. For the lean states, these are states that are going to be much more competitive than likely states. Um, but they are still, they still have, some of them still have a pretty clear advantage for a certain party. I don't know if I'd say pretty clear, but there is an advantage for a certain party in these states, and you could argue that these are toss-up states as well. Tilt states are also, but lean states are pretty much states that are decided by 1 to 5 point margins. We're going to start with some of the Democratic states here. We got New Hampshire is the first one. I want to wait until we see the September primary. I know, I had this race as likely D because I thought Don Bolduc was going to win the GOP nomination. Chuck Morse could win this nomination as well, and I think he'd be a much stronger candidate against Hassan, but I think she would still end up winning. Hassan, of course, did defeat, a Republican incumbent in 2016, Kelly Ayotte, an electoral juggernaut. And in a year the Democrats didn't do so well. Hillary barely won New Hampshire. Hassan, also barely won New Hampshire, but still it was, a victory nonetheless. And with Chris Sununu passing on the race, the Republican governor of New Hampshire, I think that's really hurt the GOP in the state of, in this state. And this would have been their top targets in 2022. It still technically is, but this would have been probably one of, the most likely states to flip in 2022 had Sununu decided to run, which pretty much everyone, including yours truly, expected. So, if Bolduc does get the nomination, I'll probably move this state back into the likely column. The state could flip for Bolduc or Morse, but I think if I was to say which one is more likely to defeat Hassan, I would put my money on Morse. But I'm still pretty questionable there. Next lean state for Democrats is the state of Arizona. Mark Kelly's running for his reelection. We've had the primaries in Arizona. I was right. Blake Masters got the nomination. Pretty much everyone expected him to get it. He was the Trump endorsed candidate. He is a pretty radical candidate. Since has said some racially insensitive things about African Americans. Relating to mass shootings. He has been funded by his former boss Peter Thiel, who is a questionable figure, if you ask me. Doesn't believe necessarily in democracy, and says America went on the wrong track when women got the right to vote. So yeah, just to put it out there, I'm not gonna say too much about Blake Masters, but Kelly is a pretty strong incumbent. He filled the seat of John McCain, who sadly passed away in 2020. Well, McCain passed away in 2018, but Kelly won the special election in 2020 to replace him. He outperformed Joe Biden by 2 points, and I think that says a lot about Kelly. He's a fundraising beast, a very strong incumbent, and I think it. I think that Blake Masters, if Doug Ducey or Mark Brnovich got the nomination, this race would be a lot closer. I think I was a little, I think I've been a little too I was a little too bullish on Mark Kelly, before the springtime, before Roe v. Wade got overturned. Arizona hasn't really moved in my characterizations. I had it as tilt Democrat in my first prediction, but since then I've had it as lean Democrat or Democratic. But I think, I was a little too bullish on Mark Kelly beforehand, but now, I think Mark Kelly is going to win. I think that Kelly's going to win his reelection. He's a very strong incumbent, very good at fundraising, has a pretty strong lead in the polls, and Arizona's polls are not that far off. I mean, Kelly is leading by 10 points in the polls, so take that with, a grain of salt. I don't think it's going to be that strong of a margin. I think it'll be around 2 points for Mark Kelly, maybe 1.9% for Mark Kelly. He is very vulnerable, but still, I think that he's a strong incumbent, and the GOP nominated the wrong candidate in this race. Especially, I think that Masters is going to do worse than Kerry Lake does in the Senate election, or than Kerry Lake does in the gubernatorial election. I think Lake has a little bit more appeal than Masters, but that's not really saying much. We're comparing apples to oranges at this point. I mean, and I'm not saying that these people are going to lose by 10 points or 15 points, but Lake could very well become the next governor of Arizona. But I think she is going to have a hard time as well. I'll talk about that more when I make my governor election prediction in the next couple of days. But I think Masters is a little too radical. Is going to be very radical for those voters in Maricopa County that voted for Kelly and Biden before. The McCain type voters, moderate Republicans. And I think Kerry Lake's going to be hard to sell for them too, but I think Lake has slightly more appeal than Masters, but that's not really saying much. So that's the state of Arizona. State of Pennsylvania, not a lot to talk. Well, not necessarily. It's not a lot to talk about. There's actually a lot to talk about in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman is doing very well in polling. Dr. Oz was the wrong candidate for Republicans to nominate. Polling has been very good for Fetterman. He is now leading by about 10 points on average in the polls. I don't know how much I believe these polls. They have a lot of undecided voters. That being said, I do agree that Fetterman is the favorite in Pennsylvania. There is some talk about, him being unable to win or get a lot of black voters in Philadelphia to turn out. But Oz is also not a very good candidate. Is not a very good candidate. I think Fetterman will win by around 2 points right now, and Oz is going to be labeled as a rhino. He is technically from New Jersey. Well, he is from New Jersey. He's only registered to vote in Pennsylvania since in 2020. And so there's, a lot, Oz is going to be viewed as a carpetbagger, basically. And, he is really not doing a lot to get people to forget about him being from New Jersey and kind of being out of touch with Pennsylvania. Fetterman, on the other hand, was mayor of Braddock. He's the current lieutenant governor of the state under Tom Wolf. And yeah, so there's some stark contrast. Fetterman is kind of, Oz is wearing, the business types, the business suits. There's some controversies with him, promoting some like, not dark magic, sorry, but like some pseudoscience proposals. Kind of, a lot of doctors have called him a quack, for his proposals. And Fetterman, is appealing to the average voter, to more voters. He's kind of taking he's not necessarily, pointing out that he's a Democrat at every single turn. He's kind of distancing himself from the Democratic Party. He is still pretty liberal, but he is, against, or he is supportive of the practice of fracking, and he wears, traditional clothing. Well, not traditional clothing, but average, everyday clothing, and that's going to help him. I think he's certainly got the momentum now. Oz could still win this race, but it's becoming harder and harder. And it's crazy to say, but I think Democrats are going to pick up Pennsylvania, and I've had that for quite some time. I haven't. Well, I mean, I've had it for the entirety of my Senate election predictions. And Fetterman's officially back on the campaign trail now. I think he had a rally just a couple of days ago. Yeah, that's it for Pennsylvania right now. I think Fetterman's going to win there by around 2 points. It might be a little bit closer, but yeah, I think Oz will do okay for a Republican in the suburbs. But at the same time, Fetterman's going to do very well in Western Pennsylvania, and he's going to do decently in Philadelphia. The Democratic primary, of course, they didn't do well in Philadelphia with black voters because of Malcolm Kenyatta, who was another candidate running in that race. But he's going to do. I think he'll do pretty decently right now. That's not to say Oz can't win in Pennsylvania. He absolutely could. But Pennsylvania's polls are pretty accurate. They have predicted the Real Clear Politics average in 2020 for Biden had him winning by 1.2%. Guess what he won by in the general election? 1.2%. So it's pretty much on the money. I don't think Fetterman's going to win by double digits, but I think he'll win by about 2 points. He's going to have, and Doug Mastriano is going to hurt Oz in this race too, in the governor's election prediction, in the governor's election that's happening at the same time. Oh boy, this video is really long. I'm sorry. So Democrats get the majority. They get 50 seats with Vice President Harris. Breaking the tie if every other race goes against their way with the state of Georgia. Raphael Warnock is pretty strong in the state. Herschel Walker continues to keep stumbling over himself. Polls continue to show Warnock ahead. I think there was a new one out recently. It was a Democratic bias poll that showed Warnock up by 3 points. But polls in Georgia, the average was pretty spot on for Warnock and Ossoff in the January 2021 runoffs, and it was pretty accurate for Biden in 2020. Yeah, here's the poll right here. It's sponsored by Charlie Bailey's campaign for lieutenant governor. So, this race could be, a little bit closer than some people are expecting. Herschel Walker still has a chance at winning. Georgia is still a swing state. But, it's going to be very hard for Republicans to flip the seat because they nominated such, a controversial candidate and one who really doesn't, seem to know, he doesn't really seem to know what he's doing, honestly. He has, all these scandals and he pretty much looks like a hypocrite and, kind of a, I hate to say this, I don't want to insult Walker, but kind of a dummy. Um, so I think Warnock wins by about 1 point. This race will probably go into a runoff in December. So yeah, the December runoff is scheduled for Georgia. If Warnock doesn't win this race, so I think that's probably what I think that this race will probably be closer on election night than it is in the runoff. Unless Warnock does do better on election day and he just wins the majority outright. But either way, it's becoming harder and harder for Republicans to win in Georgia. They've, they lost it in 2020 for the first time in 24 years on the presidential level. And yeah, Democrats are getting stronger and stronger. I think, there has been some talk about, Brian Kemp boosting Herschel Walker, and I'm sure that that's going to happen. But, still, Georgia does, the polls in Georgia are pretty accurate. And I think, Warnock's appeals a lot more moderate than Stacey Abrams does, as more of a moderate than Stacey Abrams does. And he's getting stuff done. Walker, on the other hand, really hasn't been in politics, and he's going to alienate a lot of voters, even if he is popular, with his football, background. So if the lean Republican states, we have the state of Wisconsin. I'm sorry that this video is going on for so long. But in Wisconsin, we have had the primaries as well. Mandela Barnes, as expected, won the nomination. Of course, the other candidates that dropped out, got some more, still got some votes, but Mandela Barnes won the primary easily. Ron Johnson's running for re-election, and this is a competitive race. I think people are kind of counting out Mandela Barnes, and I wouldn't do that just yet. I think Johnson is a controversial incumbent. That's putting it lightly. He was certainly not favored. He won against Russ Feingold in 2010 by about 5 points. He was not popular at all in 2016. Feingold came back to challenge him. Feingold was expected to win. It was a presidential election year. Hillary was expected to win in Wisconsin. it ended up with Trump winning Wisconsin on the presidential level, and Johnson even outperforming Trump. So I would say Johnson kind of, despite all of his, controversies, and especially with the allegations behind him with January 6th for what's been revealed by the January 6th committee, and with Wisconsin voters not really taking too much of a liking to him, he is relatively popular compared to where he was in 2016. Barnes is not really doing a lot to appeal to moderate voters in Wisconsin. That being said, I wouldn't count him out just yet. This race, I think, at worst could be a likely margin of about 7 points for Johnson, but that's really if things go really sour and get really sour for Democrats, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think right now it'll probably be a margin of about almost 5 points. I think it'll be similar to what Johnson won by in 2010. So yeah, don't count Mandela Barnes out just yet, but I agree he's not the favorite in Wisconsin. Johnson has what I would call pretty much an invisible coalition, even though he's pretty unpopular. I'm gonna try to speed this up. Um, in Ohio, I'm moving the state back down to lean, and that's because I have kind of been looking at the polling average, and yes, Tim Ryan is up. Tim Ryan is up big in Ohio, but you have to remember that Ohio, while it is still a swing state, and while J.D. Vance was not that great of a nominee, it voted for Trump by 8 points. If Tim Ryan was to win this Senate election, which I don't think he would, but let's say that he does, it would be pretty much a blue wave year for Democrats in the Senate. Now, that could happen. I'm not saying Tim Ryan won't win. I'm just saying I don't think he's favored to win. And the polling average in 2020 said that Trump was going to win the state by about 1 percentage point. He ended up winning it by 8. So let's say that the polls are off in Ohio by 7% as well, according to the 538 average. That would put Vance at a 3.5% victory, which is a lean margin. I think Tim Ryan's doing a lot to appeal to Trump voters, and I think that that's working for him. But Ohio's polls are notoriously bad. They overestimated Democratic support in 2020 by a very large amount. Wisconsin and Ohio's polls are notoriously bad, especially in recent years. And Trump does have a lot of appeal in these states. But J.D. Vance, has made some controversial comments, but I do think, he's going to pull ahead and, win this race. I think, Tim Ryan will outperform Joe Biden. I think the worst that this race could get for Tim Ryan is he loses by 9 points, but that's even more than Biden lost the state by. And Tim Ryan's a more moderate candidate that will be able to appeal to some Trump voters. So right now I have this as a 3 or 4 point margin for J.D. Vance. But we'll have to see what happens in the state of Ohio. But I would still say that take these polls with a grain of salt. Now in North Carolina, there's something interesting happening in the state. I am very fascinated at these new polls that have been coming out. Ted Budd, is running against Sherry Beasley. Sherry Beasley is the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. She barely lost her race in 2020. Ted Budd's a current congressman who's running to succeed retiring Republican Senator Richard Burr. This race could have been a dead heat pretty much if Pat McCrory, the former governor, won the Republican primary against Budd, but Budd got Trump's endorsement and he cruised to his primary victory. But these last two polls have been pretty concerning for Budd. Now, excuse me, let me take a sip. Blueprint polling is a Democratic internal, or not internal, but Democratic sponsored liberal leaning poll, has Beasley up by 4. I do not believe this at all. There are a lot of undecideds in this poll. And in this other one, which was around last time when we made the my last prediction, there's 17% of our undecided voters. It was a John Bolden Super PAC poll. So that is concerning. I did originally have the state as likely. I was thinking about moving it back up to likely, but seeing how close the polling averages have gotten in the state of North Carolina, I do think that this race is going to be about a 2 or 3 point victory for Ted Budd, maybe 4 points. After he won the primary, I was expecting like a 6 or 7 point victory for Budd. But I think Sherry Beasley is doing a similarly good job as John Fetterman. She's distancing herself from the Democratic National Party, and she's appealing. I think she'll be very appealing, to African American voters. Cal Cunningham and Deborah K. Ross, were both white Democrats, who obviously got the black vote. Um, in North Carolina, but Sherry Beasley being an African American will, inspire some more turnout. But I do think Ted Budd was the better candidate for the GOP to nominate in this race. The polls in North Carolina were terrible in 2020, expecting a Biden win and a Cal Cunningham win. Neither of those happened in the state. Um, Quite surprising. But when the polls are this close, I do think Bud will do better. The state could be likely still, but I really don't think so. I think it's a lean state as of right now, and I think that, this is overestimating Democratic support. But yeah, let's keep our eyes on the state of North Carolina because something interesting is happening in this state. So after all that, we got one more state, and it's the state of Nevada. Now, I've had Nevada going left and right, back and forth, back and forth. I think that this state is really going to be the closest Senate election in 2022. And I know that seems weird to see Arizona be more Democratic than Nevada. I know it's weird to say that Nevada might go red while Arizona goes blue because, historically Nevada has been bluer than Arizona. And I think this is going to be one of those rare occurrences where Arizona votes to the left of Nevada. The margins were pretty close in 2020 to each other. Nevada was Biden plus 2.4%, Arizona was Biden plus 0.3%, so about a 2 point difference, but they are getting close to one another. Look at 2012. Look at how much difference was between the two. About a 5 point difference between the two, now 2 points. So I think we could be seeing a future where Nevada is redder than Arizona. Nevada is shifting to the right, but even with, bad turnout in Las Vegas in 2020, Biden was still able to win the state by the same amount Hillary won by, and, he made this correct assumption, and I'm kind of, rewording unbiased election predictions, but he looked at it and he said, if I want to win, I'm going to need to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and I might put some money into Arizona and Georgia. If I'm not winning Nevada, I'm not winning the election. But Hillary won the state, and I kind of have to, he did campaign. I'm not saying Biden did not campaign in the state of Nevada. He absolutely did, but the polling showed that he was pretty had a pretty comfortable lead in Nevada. He won it narrowly, yes, but he still won it. And he knew that he had other states that needed his attention. Nevada was the state that kept his hopes of winning the presidency alive, but he couldn't win if he didn't focus on some more states. And Nevada's polls are one of some is one of Nevada's one of the states where polling has routinely underestimated Democrats before. Catherine Cortez Masto is a pretty strong incumbent, not as strong as Jackie Rosen. Adam Laxalt's a very good challenger. I most recently had this race as tilt red, but I'm going to move it back to the Democratic column very slightly. And the reason why I'm doing this is because, hearing what Unbiased Election Predictions has to say, I'm looking at all these different election YouTubers, I'm looking at all the data, looking at past polls, and Emerson College is a pretty accurate pollster in the state of Nevada. They had Biden winning the state by one, Catherine Cortez Masto winning in 2016 her Senate election by one, she won by two, and in 2018 they had Jackie Rosen winning by 4 points, she won by five. Right now, the most recent pollster or poll from Emerson College shows Cortez Masto winning by 3 points. I don't think that's going to happen. There's a lot of other undecided voters, and it is registered voters. But Nevada is, while it is a swing state, it is a blue state, and I do expect it to be the closest state in this Senate cycle. But I still think that Laxalt, has a lot of work to do, and his comments about abortion in a state that is heavily pro-choice, that's not going to help him. I think and he does have a lost race under, the rug. He lost to Steve Sisolak in 2018, even though polls, suggested that he was going to win against Sisolak. He underperformed those by about 4. Sisolak won by, 4.1%. So it's not impossible for Laxalt to win. He's a pretty decent candidate. Of course, he's the grandson of Paul Laxalt, the former senator from this very Senate seat. So it's very possible the Laxalt wins, but Cortez Masto, is in a state that is usually bluer than a lot of these other states that I think will vote to the right of all of them in these Senate elections, but it's going to be very hard for me to see Laxalt winning when all these other states are going blue. I know, I made that argument before that Nevada's going to be redder than all of these states, and I still believe that. But, when looking at how pro-choice Nevada is, looking at, Cortez Masto's appeal to Hispanic women, and looking at the fact that Nevada is a state where Hispanic voters are usually more Democratic than in states like Florida, I think that Cortez Masto pulls off a very narrow victory here in the state of Nevada. So after all that, sorry how long this video is. I bet it's like 45 minutes, like my governor election predictions. I hope it's not, but we'll just have to see. So, this is the final map for my prediction. Not the final prediction, but of course, in this map, for my 8th prediction for the 2022 U.S. Senate elections, Democrats gain a seat for the state of Pennsylvania, hold on to all of their other seats. Republicans hold at 49, holding on to most of their seats. Democrats pick up one seat in the Senate. Republicans don't make any flips in the Senate as of right now, according to my prediction. This is not fact. This is just what I think is going to happen as of right now. I could very well see this changing, and it probably will change. But yeah, this is the map right now. Democrats get 51 Senate seats. Republicans get 49. If Manchin's, they don't need Kamala Harris anymore unless, one of the Democratic senators, Manchin or Sinema, or anyone else decides to defect to the Republican side on some votes. They don't need Harris as that tie-breaking vote anymore. Sinema and Manchin's votes combined can stop Democratic legislation, but if Sinema votes for something and Manchin votes against it, it still gets passed with Harris's tie-breaking vote. So, thank you guys so much for watching this very long video, I'm sure. Make sure to like and subscribe, share, turn on notifications, check out my main channel, Interactor127, where I used to post political videos, but I haven't in recent years. Or, not in recent years, but, and for about a year, I figured I would just make this channel to do all my political stuff, just so I can focus that channel on other stuff like gaming. So if you want to see some more non-political stuff from me, go over there, check out my reaction videos and my video game walkthroughs. If you want to hang out, have a good time, check that out. Also check out my friend, my comrade on YouTube, Growlings666, who will hopefully be back with you guys soon. Gonna have to get on him with getting some more uploads going on. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time when I talk about all things politics, and hopefully for not so long. See ya.